My mom and dad were married in Michigan and divorced when I was 2. So I really don't know my parents to have had a relationship together, but they were really good co-parents. And then when I turned probably around 12 or 13 years old, my mom graduated from X-ray school and we moved to Texas for work. I found myself being very alone in the beginning, especially through middle school. But we made it, and I don't think you could pay me to go back now. I graduated high school in '99, and I wanted to be a police officer. I'm not quite sure what motivated me to go down that route. I've always been kind of a square, never been a rule pusher or breaker. So it was just kind of a fit for me.
In 2002, 21-year-old Amanda Siggers is in her second year studying criminal justice at San Jacinto College in Houston, Texas.
I was a young girl that had the world at my fingertips, really. I was having a decent time with my friends, exploring the city and just living life. One day, a friend and I were preparing for a test, and we chose to go to a local bookstore, coffee shop, and study. We happened to look over, and there was this guy sitting at an adjacent table. He was very handsome. After a while, conversation ensued with him.
25-year-old Cy Ghosh tells Amanda and her friend that he works as a pharmaceutical sales rep, but intends to go back to school.
Cy had told me that he graduated from UT with a pre-med degree. He applied to get into Baylor College of Medicine, and he was accepted, but he denied the acceptance and ended up venturing into something else. He eventually got both of our phone numbers, and I thought for sure he was gonna call her, but he ended up calling me. And I was ecstatic. The beginning of our relationship was very fun. So I was very much a gentleman from the word go, and he really just laid out the red carpet.
He was very, very polite, very cordial, pretty much like Amanda had told me. He was a tall, handsome man, and I knew that she was, she was very smitten.
Culturally, he was very different from me. I found him to be very interesting. Even though he was raised here in the United States, he had a lot of Eastern values. His parents were first-generation Indians. I got to learn a lot about the temples and just the peaceful nature of Hinduism. It's such a beautiful culture. He told me that his father and mother were divorced, and prior to us getting together, he had moved out of his father's home and into his mother's home. He was very uncomfortable at his mother's house. She would consistently be on him, nagging him about something, mostly his career, because in that culture, career and education is number one. They generally live in the home for quite some time, even after college, in an effort to save as much money as possible. And so he was, staying in the house even at an older age because that's culturally just what was of the norm for them. Cy's mother's name is Lapika. She was very much about money, prestige. She didn't care for the union between Cy and I. He relayed that message to me, and I feel like she wanted him to marry an Indian woman and not a white woman. But we chose to look past it. 3 months later, she realized that he was serious about me because he actually brought me home, and we ended up staying the night there. And she opened up the door, and I was there. She shut the door very fast, and Cy had to go put that fire out. She was very vocal about me being a white bitch, and she didn't want that white bitch staying the night in her house. It was certainly a shock, but I knew that he wasn't going to listen to that. I knew how he felt about me, but it was very hurtful. We ended up leaving, and I don't believe I ever stayed the night there again.
Cy's dad, on the other hand, welcomes Amanda with open arms.
Cy's father, his name is Biz. I did not feel like he was racially against me or us being together. I felt like he genuinely wanted to see us succeed in life. He was just a very kind soul.
In late 2002, Biz asks his son and Amanda to come live with him and his current wife, Kay. He has been diagnosed with terminal cancer and wants to spend his last days with his son.
The first few weeks were good. Kay was on board with everything. She knew that we were there to help and not to hinder. But then it started to decline. I could tell that there was tension between Kay and Cy. Cy went on to tell me that Kay would say false things about him. Eventually, it felt like I was walking on eggshells everywhere I went. One evening, Kay cornered me. She said, "You have no idea the person that you're getting involved with. You have no idea who he is, and I would highly encourage you to stay away." At the time, I thought, whatever, I'm in love, and he's so good to me, and he has nothing good to say about her, so it tainted my ability to really take her seriously.
Despite the tension, all three focus on caring for Biz. Until his death in July of 2003, Cy is inconsolable.
He was devastated. Biz was a primary force in his life. And once he passed, I think that Cy felt empty. I think he felt scared. Very different, mentally very different.
Things come to a head when Amanda finds something suspicious in Cy's car.
I found a box of condoms, and it prompted a lot of questions. He became defensive, and it led to a horrific argument, and I started to get a little bit scared. And I had attempted to make a phone call, and he ripped the phone out of the wall. So I made my way to the front door, and I pushed the panic button on the alarm, which immediately sends a call to 911. So I knew that they were on the way, and he knew they were on the way as well, and he left. So the police showed up, and I let them know what had transpired. I did not press charges. It was hours later that he came back, and I vividly remember just being so upset that he was gone, not knowing what was going to transpire, if we were breaking up.
Cy begs Amanda's forgiveness, and Amanda rationalizes that he is deeply grieving and not acting like himself.
I forgave him, and we just chose to ultimately put it behind us. I had a lot of big hopes for our relationship, and I wanted things to be normal again. So I just made it okay. And we were fine. We were fine after that.
In 2005, Amanda and Cy decide to take the next big step.
I was very happy for my daughter to get married. She was very happy about getting married.
And by this time, Cy's mom has accepted Amanda into her son's life.
So we had a Hindu ceremony at the Meenakshi temple, and 2 days later we had the Christian ceremony. My family came to the Hindu ceremony. I had to wear a red sari, red and gold. It was absolutely beautiful.
The highlight was when I saw them walking towards the limousine to spend the rest of their lives together. That's the way it was supposed to work.
I felt like my dreams were coming true. We were in forward motion.
Cy applies to medical school, and life seems on track. Until he does an about-face and pressures Amanda to change her career.
It came out of left field for sure. He was very adamant that being a police officer, that was a blue-collar job. It wasn't acceptable to him or his family, and he made it very clear that it was not where he saw his life going.
Instead, he wants her to go into healthcare as well.
I was to go through nursing school, and we were going to open and run a practice together. In theory, it was the fairy tale. I caved in because I felt like he knew better than I did. He was 5 years older than me, and he had a plan.
Cy chooses a podiatry school in Des Moines, Iowa, and Amanda gets accepted into a nearby nursing school.
When they moved to Iowa, they were about 10 hours closer to Michigan, I think, so I could see them more often. I would take the train over. help her decorate. And I love doing it. As a father, it was great for me to be able to do that.
But Amanda doesn't adapt well to her new field of study.
Well, I was in a clinical setting one day, and I ended up passing out. And that's when my professor pulled me to the side and said, you know, you may want to rethink your career choice.
She said, Dad, I really want to do it. But she knew that she couldn't do it because she couldn't stay on the side of blood, so.
Amanda decides to withdraw from the program.
When I told Cy, he didn't react well. He made it very clear that he was embarrassed by my decision. He told me he was very disappointed and that I needed to do it. I stood my ground, that I wanted to do something else. And ultimately, he had called me white trash and bitch and wished that I was dead. That's when I realized that I had made a mistake.
When Amanda Ghosh quits nursing school, her husband Cy becomes verbally abusive.
But I'm a loyal soul. I'm very loyal to my mate. And I chose to stay. I didn't think that there wasn't anything that we couldn't fix. I took my vows, my marriage vows, very seriously.
Amanda forges ahead despite Cy's disapproval.
I took all of my criminal justice and nursing courses and wrapped it into a general studies degree, basically the highest level associate degree you can get from a junior college, and I moved on. But I didn't feel proud of that accomplishment. Actually, Cy belittled me because it wasn't good enough, and so I felt like a failure.
And I felt that there was things going on that I didn't know about, which relayed into their marriage some friction.
He definitely made me feel devalued. I felt alone. I felt isolated. I missed my family.
And then, a call from out of the blue brings family directly into Amanda's life in an unexpected way.
Amber was my half-sister. She was born to my dad and my stepmom, Joyce. She was 4 years younger than me, almost to the day. The only sister I've ever had. And as she got older, she became dependent on drugs. We went our separate ways.
While struggling with addiction, 21-year-old Amber gives birth to a baby girl, Kelsey. When Kelsey is a few months old, Amber is ordered by a Michigan judge to enter rehab for 90 days.
The paternity had not been established on Kelsey. And I received a phone call from CPS asking me if I would be interested in doing a temporary foster placement for my niece. It was a no-brainer for me, but I wanted to make sure it was okay with Cy to bring her into the home, and he agreed.
In January of 2007, Amanda travels to Michigan to get her niece.
When I first saw Kelsey, she was only 11 pounds at 7 months old. I knew instantly that I was never going to give her back.
Amber was not capable of taking care of a child, but Amanda was, so I was happy that Kelsey was in a safe place.
I knew that I was on the path that God had laid out for me. She was a sickly baby due to being born addicted. She cried incessantly. It is very hard to deal with a baby that never stops crying. But somehow you figure out how to deal with it.
Amber didn't finish her rehabilitation, so the court awarded Amanda to keep taking care of Kelsey.
Even though he never said it, I think Cy felt like he had made a mistake. I think he quickly realized that the responsibility of a child was far more than he anticipated. Unfortunately, it wore Cy down over time. I was doing the laundry one day and the baby was crying. I walked around the corner and he was shaking her violently. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that he was doing what he was doing to such a tiny, fragile little baby. I was just blown away. And it was in that moment that I knew I had to leave. He has absolutely crossed the line. I need to get her out of there. He didn't deserve the title of being a dad.
In May 2007, Amanda moves back to Houston with Kelsey, leaving Cy behind in Iowa.
I was gonna take care of this baby. That was my mission. Why the career choices that I had made and why it didn't pan out. I knew that I was supposed to be Kelsey's mom. I was able to find a townhouse apartment right next door to my mom, which was extremely helpful because she was able to help me with the baby. I got a part-time job so that we could survive. Somehow we made it work. All of a sudden I became a single mom. We were divorced in December of 2008. He filed for divorce and it was uncontested. It was easy, 2-page divorce. I felt like it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me at the same time. It was such a weird feeling.
Amanda enrolls in a sonography program for training in ultrasound.
I felt very confident. I found my independence. I was going to school and I was working full-time. Kelsey was going to daycare and thriving in daycare. We were happy. I was free of all of the dysfunction that I had lived in for so long.
But Amanda's newfound peace will not last for long.
So I moved back to Texas in December of 2009, early 2010. And that's when the stalking began.
I can't imagine what that would feel like to be victimized, stalked, harassed, knowing there is a weapon involved. This behavior can't go on forever. When is somebody gonna break?
Amanda Harris has moved on with her life, while Cy flounders.
Ironically enough, he decided that medical school wasn't quite right for him.
Cy drops out of podiatry, converts to Christianity, and returns to Houston.
One day he called me and told me that he had obtained a job at a pizza place near my apartment. And I thought, why in the world would he take a job delivering pizzas? And then it dawned on me that he could drive in and out of my apartment complex on the daily, on the hourly sometimes. I found it to be bizarre behavior.
He's a pizza delivery driver. Where being a law enforcement officer wasn't good enough for her, now he's going to drive and deliver pizzas, not because he wants to, but because it allows him to have the freedom to drive by and check on her whenever he wants to.
In early 2011, 2.5 years after her divorce, Amanda moves to a new home in a new neighborhood and doesn't share her address with Cy. It's a new beginning.
I was encouraged by my friends to get out there, so I put my profile up on an online dating site and I met Wayne.
Wayne Harris works in the motorsports industry and, like Amanda, is divorced with one child, a boy named Nick.
So I met up with him and he thought he was an attractive man and our conversations just flowed so well. I just knew right away. I was so ecstatic to feel this feeling again, to know that I was capable of feeling, the joy, the butterflies again. And he was as well, that we just didn't miss a beat. We decided that we were gonna see each other the very next day, which turned into the very next day and every day thereafter, unless he was out of town for work.
And I thought he's just a fantastic guy. Real nice to be around, very energetic.
So Super Bowl Sunday rolled around and Wayne came over that evening and I was cooking and I would oftentimes let Kelsey play at the park right there because I could see her. She's basically within arm's reach of me. So Kelsey's playing, Wayne and I are talking, and I get a knock at the door, and it's the police officer that lives on site. He had received a call from a concerned person letting them know that I let my child play outside unattended.
Amanda invites the officer inside to discuss it, embarrassed that her new boyfriend is a witness.
We all had conversation. Wayne had conversation with him. We were all in agreement that she was certainly within an eye shot, ear shot, arm shot of me and that she was perfectly fine. I asked the officer who had made the call, and he couldn't tell me, but I knew in my gut who was at the root of this. I felt frustrated. I felt violated again. It's a very uneasy feeling to know you're being watched. At this point, my relationship is blossoming with Wayne, and I didn't let him know everything that was going on because I certainly didn't want to taint a good relationship with my baggage and drama. I didn't want to bring that into the relationship.
Amanda's strategy is to block Cy completely.
I figured he didn't get his way. Hopefully he'll move on now, but that never happened. And he knew exactly what button to push, which was going after my daughter.
It has been 5 years since Amanda took custody of Kelsey. Now, as Amanda is on the verge of becoming Kelsey's legal mother, Cy starts to stir things up.
What he did is he cleverly went to a therapist, told the therapist all of his grievance toward me, and made me out to look like a neglectful mother. And it was her duty to call CPS by state law. I received a phone call from CPS that they were going to interview my daughter that day. I felt mortified, and as soon as she stepped foot in my door, she realized quickly that Kelsey was just fine.
I just couldn't believe that he did that. It was like, when does it stop?
Kelsey, the adopted daughter, is the reason she left him in the first place. So by calling CPS, if that worker had not done a thorough and proper investigation or had just rushed to judgment, then Amanda could have very easily lost Kelsey. And for all intents and purposes, her niece, who is now her daughter, is the most important thing she has. And it would have been devastating.
Concerned that Cy's unpredictable behavior is escalating, Amanda seeks help from the local police.
I don't think it's ever going to go away, and I honestly have no idea how to deal with it. I've gone to the police department at this point. I've talked to officers that have asked me to just ignore it, and as long as he doesn't put his hands on me, there's really nothing they can do. It's very frustrating. I felt horribly harassed, unprotected, and you feel so helpless.
Wayne steps up and asks Amanda and Kelsey to move in with him on the other side of Houston.
It was the best feeling. I felt Kelsey was going to have a great role model, a great father figure. Moving to the north side of town was good because I didn't know where I had gone. And so the stalking had come to a halt for a short period of time. Life was actually going really, really well.
It was very, very comforting to know that she was with somebody that was safe, and Kelsey too.
That all changes one night when Wayne is away on business.
I woke up to gunshots outside of my bedroom window. I knew he was out there.
In 2012, in the Houston suburb of Tomball, Amanda Ghosh is awakened by gunshots outside her window.
I immediately called the police.
She did not see Cy shoot the gun, but she did see him get in the car. When that happened, well, that's when I really became concerned.
When they showed up, he wasn't there. They checked the perimeter of the home. They didn't find any shell casings. They spoke with the neighbors. None of the neighbors had heard any gunshots, and so I kind of felt like they didn't believe me, and it really went nowhere.
Amanda is on high alert, and it's not long before another incident occurs.
One night, Wayne and I were sitting in the living room watching TV, and our dog ran to the window and was barking his tail off. So I knew somebody was out there, and I had a feeling that it was Cy. Wayne hopped up quite angrily, and I encouraged him to just settle down for half a second, let me call the police and get them there this time so that they could witness what was going on. They were right around the corner, so it only took a couple of minutes, and they caught him there. Thank God. This time he had finally been caught, and they issued him a trespass violation and a warning. We actually felt good after that for a while. We didn't see him for quite some time after that.
With Cy in her rear view, Amanda commits to her bright future.
We decided to get married on 12/12/12 at 12/12 at the Justice of the Peace.
They were very, very happy. And in fact, at the time that they got married, they adopted Kelsey at the same time.
I had been fighting for custody of Kelsey for the better part of 7 years. It was quite the process, but we'd finally gotten there. And then 2 days later, I found out I was pregnant for Gemma.
It was great to see. Wayne wrote notes for the unborn baby for her to read later on and, when she grows up. So he was very, very excited about being a new father.
Gemma was born with a very, very rare condition called bacterial association. She was born with only one kidney, as well as no esophagus, a cardiac defect, and a vertebral defect. Needless to say, she required 24/7 attention, care.
She was a perfect little child. Of course, all of my grandkids were perfect. They are a blessing.
About a year and a half after Gemma was born, we moved into this beautiful home that neither one of us thought we would ever be able to live in. And here we achieved it. We were on top of the world at this point. Christmas Day 2015, we woke up rather early with the kiddos because they were just super excited. And we just sat down to open our gifts, and I hear a tap at the door. And who else but Cy?
Cy tells Amanda that he would like to pray with her and her 2 daughters.
I just couldn't believe that he even came back around, especially at a time when the family's getting together for Christmas.
Wayne came unglued that day. He escorted Cy off of our property with a lot of profanity and a lot of anger and aggression.
Cy's stalking has been going on for almost 6 years, ever since Amanda decided to leave him.
There are some individuals who cannot take no for an answer. They cannot move on and regain their sense of balance until they're back in control again. Maybe if Amanda were to run back to him and he could say, "No, I don't want you," then he would have control again and he could move on. Right now, none of the decisions are his, except the ones that he uses to torture and drive them crazy.
She is aware of Texas's strong stand your ground laws and asks the police for more information about self-defense.
So I asked the officer what my rights were. If I had the right to hold him at citizen's arrest until the police got there. He told me that we definitely had that right.
Wayne owns a gun and suggests Amanda buy one too.
Wayne encouraged me to go get my license to carry and buy a weapon to protect myself due to all of this incessant harassment, stalking. So I took a few classes and tried to become as capable with my weapon as possible. June 28th, 2017 was Kelsey's 11th birthday, and she chose to just have a she day. She chose to do all kinds of things like get her nails done, get her hair done, very girly stuff.
Amanda, Kelsey, and Kelsey's friend Georgia meet up with Wayne, his son Nick, and baby Gemma at Kelsey's favorite restaurant.
And after dinner, Gemma was exhausted, so I asked Wayne to take her back home so that I could finish shopping with Kelsey and her friend for her birthday. So he obliged and reached over and gave me a kiss, a really long kiss. The kids were in the background ewing. I'll forever remember it. I stayed at the mall with Georgia and Kelsey for probably about another hour. Kelsey asked me if her friend could stay the night, and I said sure. So all three of us went back to our home. And as I was rounding the corner of my street, I saw Cy on his hands and knees at my front door with Wayne pointing a gun at him. I knew immediately that I needed to protect my family. I reached into my glove box, I grabbed my gun, and I told the girls to sit down and not to move. I got out of the car, I held the gun in that direction, and I called the police.
Hi, I need a police officer as soon as possible. I'm making
Hold on.
a arrest right now.
You can't make a citizen's arrest.
Yes, I've already been informed that I can. I have an ongoing case against this person.
Ma'am.
Get down! Get down!
Who is this man to you?
He is my ex-husband.
On June 28, 2017, Jennifer Provoznik is visiting friends who live down the street from where Amanda and Wayne live.
I work in law enforcement, and it's my day off, so I just wanted to really enjoy my day with my friends.
They are oblivious to the scene unfolding a couple of yards away.
My name is Amanda Harris. I've been down there many times to tell you guys what's going on. He's been told by the police to stay away hundreds of times.
Do you have a weapon right now?
My husband and I both have a weapon.
Okay, I'm going to need you to put that weapon up, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay, you and your husband both.
Wayne, he wants you to put your weapon down.
Does this other male have a weapon?
I have no idea.
From inside the car, 11-year-old Kelsey also calls 911.
Send him over right now, please.
What's going on?
My mom's ex-husband, he literally stalks us and he's at our house right now. My parents are yelling at him right now. It's done. I'm sorry. I'm just really scared.
Sorry, I'm getting out of you. Stay
Oh my God.
And I hear 3 distinct gunshots and a woman screaming. So at this time, my training kicks in, and I told my friend, I was like, listen, call 911. I'm going down there.
I had been shot, but I didn't know it. It was all so surreal. I saw my husband fall to the ground out of the corner of my eye. And as I sat up from the position I was in, I was shot again. And I was laying between the 2 cars when I saw Sai's feet moving around the car and circle back to me. And when I looked up, he was holding a gun at my head, and he pulled the trigger. But it didn't fire. I had been saved by the grace of God. It didn't fire. And some divine force picked me up, and I got to my feet and I ran for my life.
I see a woman running into the house and slamming the door. And then there's this guy just standing there in between 2 cars, looking around, and he looks right at me and then takes off running.
Sai Ghosh gets in a car and flees the scene.
And that's when a little girl gets out of the car. She looks at me and she starts screaming, "Save my daddy." And I look down, there's a body in the driveway. And I was like, listen, I said, there's a woman behind me. You take your friend. You do not stop till you get to her. Do you understand me? And she goes, yes. And so I sent her off at that point. I look at the individual on the ground, and I knew there was no point of me even attempting CPR or any other life-saving matters.
All I could think is he's gonna fire through this door. And I realized in that moment that I had left Kelsey in the back seat of the car. I ran back out the front door, and I was met by a very kind lady.
I know that she's wounded, and she's also in shock. She's yelling about her babies being missing. She's also screaming, I knew he would do something like this. I knew it. And then she notices the man in the driveway.
She kindly grabbed me by my arm. That's when I realized I'd been shot in my arm. And she walked me over to his body. And I was able to say goodbye to my husband. And they were putting me in an ambulance shortly thereafter.
When police arrive, they find 5-year-old Gemma and 17-year-old Nick hiding in a closet. That's when Amanda's father drops by on his way home to say happy birthday to Kelsey.
As I got out of the car, there was 3 or 4 policemen that came up to me. And the first thing they said was, Amanda's in the hospital, but she's okay. She's been shot, but she's going to be okay. And right at that point, that's when my heart just fell. And the first thing I thought of was the kids. Are the kids okay? What happened? And they said, yeah, the kids are here. They're with some of the neighbors that are here. And then I said, well, what about Wayne? That's when they continued to tell me he didn't make it.
We begin with that breaking news alert out of League City. A man police initially wanted for questioning is now wanted for murder.
We were the first news crew on the scene. We're getting there, and it's the chaos of the scene because you have a gunman on the run, you have dead body and someone seriously wounded, and everyone's trying to figure out what happened.
They put the hospital on lockdown because Cy was on the run.
I was at her bedside the whole time. I don't know, it's like a movie, a bad movie. It was a horrible nightmare.
So as this statewide manhunt is going on, police had reason to believe that Cy was going to try to run for the border. And it was a checkpoint in El Paso. They were able to identify that Cy was trying to cross. There wasn't much of a resistance. At that point, even Cy had figured out that this was over and he was going to be taken into custody. When they look inside the vehicle, they do find a gun. They find several clips with bullets inside where the casings match the 12 that were found on scene of the shooting back in Lake City.
I don't know how I made it through. I really don't. But I have children, and they needed me, and life didn't stop. I had to get out of bed every day. I had to accept that he was never coming back. Thank God for my children. I stayed in the house until the trial came, and it took us 2 years to go to trial.
As the family tries to heal, Amanda assumes the only time she will ever have to encounter Cy again is in court. But she is wrong.
Well, one day I get this phone call, and I can clearly see that it's the jail on my caller ID. So I turn on the voice recorder, and I took the phone call.
Hello?
Hello?
I just want to apologize to you. I'm sorry for everything, Amanda. I'm really sorry.
Is this a joke?
No, I just want to apologize.
You almost killed me. Is this a joke?
No, Amanda, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I got scared.
Got scared?
I could not believe that I was listening to this person on the other end of the phone. How is this even allowed? Who is running this jail and allowing a murderer to call his victim?
I just want to pray with you guys. I'll put you on the phone real quick before we go to trial. Can I pray with you? Please, Jesus, please comfort Amanda. Please help me never harm her, never to cause her problems again.
Cy's staggering ability to keep harassing Amanda will even continue through the trial itself.
So I was charged with murder in the first degree, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and stalking.
In the middle of the case, Cy fires his defense attorney and decides he's going to defend himself now.
But I know that he wanted to get me on the stand and question me, and that was his way of doing it. He was able to question me for a very long period of time.
Cy thought that Amanda was going to wilt on the stand. That's not what happened.
Amanda comes through this a hero. The fact that she does not cave, that she looks him straight in the eye and answers his questions. So if he wanted control, he didn't get it. He got to talk to her, but he didn't get the responses, the feeling, the control that he was seeking. So in that case, Amanda comes out a winner.
I don't know how the law allows your attacker to question you. How is that even possible? But it happened.
After the trial wraps up, the jury is quick to return guilty verdicts. And on March 5th, 2020, Cy is sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years.
I was disappointed because I feel like he should have gotten life without the possibility of parole. I truly believe that if he were to walk the streets again, if he were to ever get out, that he will kill me. He will finish the job.
I hope he never gets out, and all I can do is just say, let Jesus take the wheel. Even though I'm that close to her, I can't imagine going through what she went through. But we get through it every day. It's a process where we're all working through it.
I was angry with the police. I feel like they failed my family, and I think Cy Ghosh is pure evil. But there's still a big life to live, and I choose to just be happy. We have what, 40? I have 40 summers left. I'm gonna make the best of the 40 summers I have left. Wayne wouldn't want me to waste them.
The morning of April 22, 2016, began like any other morning in rural southern Ohio. The sun rose over the quiet hills of Pike County, casting a soft light across fields, forests, and the narrow country roads that connected small communities where neighbors knew each other's names and families often lived only a few minutes apart. It was the kind of place where people waved when passing a stranger on the road, where children grew up surrounded by familiar faces, and where the rhythm of life moved slowly. But that morning, beneath the calm surface of this peaceful corner of Ohio, something unimaginable had already happened. 8 people were dead. And the truth behind their deaths would remain hidden for more than 2 years. For the people of Pike County, the day started with confusion. Then came fear. Then came the realization that something had happened that would forever change the way they looked at their own community. The first signs of horror came not from a stranger, not from a dramatic confrontation, but from someone who knew the family. Someone who simply arrived expecting an ordinary visit. A relative of the Roden family went to one of the homes near Piketon that morning. The purpose was simple: check on the property, make sure everything was all right, and take care of the animals. There was no reason to expect anything unusual. The homes belonging to the Roden family were scattered across a rural area surrounded by trees and open land. They were places where daily life unfolded away from the noise of big cities. Places where people cooked meals, raised children, worked, argued, laughed, and planned for the future. But when the door opened, the world inside was completely different. The person who entered discovered a scene that no family member should ever have to witness. Inside the homes were members of the Roden family, who would never wake up again. The shock of that discovery quickly spread. A call for help was made. Authorities arrived, expecting perhaps a single tragedy, a crime involving one victim, one location, one explanation. But as investigators moved from one property to another, the reality became darker. This was not one victim. This was not one home. This was not a random act of violence. 8 people had been killed. Across multiple locations. Within the same family circle. The victims were not strangers caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were parents, children, siblings, partners, and relatives. They were people who had spent years building ordinary lives in a place where extraordinary violence seemed impossible. The victims were Christopher Roden Sr., Dana Roden, Christopher Roden Jr., Clarence Frankie Roden, Hannah Mae Roden, Hannah Hazel Gilly, Kenneth Roden, and Gary Roden. 8 names. 8 lives. 8 empty spaces left behind at dinner tables, inside homes, and within a community that would never feel the same again. Among those killed was 16-year-old Christopher Roden Jr. He was still a teenager, still at an age when life was supposed to be about discovering the world, making plans, and imagining the future. Instead, his life ended inside the same place where he should have felt safest. Also among the victims was 19-year-old Hannah Roden, a young mother whose life was still unfolding. She had dreams, responsibilities, and a young daughter who depended on her. Her death would later become one of the most important pieces in understanding why this terrible crime happened. But on that morning, investigators did not know the reason. They only knew what they were facing. A massacre. As police walked through the crime scenes, they began noticing details that made the case even more disturbing. This was not a chaotic act of violence. There was no evidence of a desperate struggle. No indication that victims had fought back. No sign that this had been an unpredictable explosion of anger. Instead, investigators believed they were looking at something much colder. Something planned. The person or people responsible appeared to have known exactly where to go. They appeared to understand the layout of the properties. They appeared to know who would be there. And most frightening of all, they appeared to have taken the time to prepare. The killer had not simply arrived at one location and acted impulsively. The killer had moved through multiple homes. The killer had entered spaces where families slept. The killer had turned places of comfort into places of unimaginable pain. As news spread throughout Pike County, fear replaced the sense of safety that had always defined the area. People began locking doors that they had rarely locked before. Neighbors looked at each other differently. Every unfamiliar vehicle on a country road became something to notice. Every unanswered question became another reason for concern. Because the biggest mystery was not only who had committed the murders. It was how someone could do this in a small community without anyone knowing. How could 8 people disappear from this world in one night? How could someone plan such a devastating attack and leave behind so few obvious answers? In the early days of the investigation, theories moved quickly. Some people wondered if drugs were involved. Others questioned whether the murders were connected to criminal activity. The Roden family had previously faced investigations involving marijuana cultivation, and some believed the killings could have been related to illegal activity. But investigators refused to rush toward assumptions. They looked deeper. They examined relationships. They studied the victims. They searched for conflicts that might have existed beneath the surface. And slowly, a different story began to emerge. A story not about strangers. A story about people who knew each other. A story about a broken relationship, a custody dispute, and a family conflict that prosecutors would later describe as the foundation of a deadly plan. The investigation eventually turned toward another family. The Wagner family. George Wagner III, known as Billy Wagner. Angela Wagner. Their sons, Edward Jake Wagner and George Wagner IV. At first, the idea that people from a family could be connected to such a brutal crime seemed almost impossible. In communities like Pike County, family names carried weight. People grew up together. They attended the same schools. They lived near each other. They shared memories. The idea that one family could intentionally destroy another family was something many people struggled to accept. But investigators began focusing on the relationship between Edward Wagner and Hannah Roden. Years earlier, Jake Wagner and Hannah Roden had been in a relationship. Together, they had a daughter. But after their relationship ended, a conflict developed over custody of the child. What began as a personal disagreement would later become the center of the prosecution's explanation for the murders. According to investigators, the desire for control and the anger surrounding the custody dispute eventually transformed into something far more dangerous. Something irreversible. Something that would leave 8 people dead. But before the arrests, before the courtroom battles, before the truth slowly emerged, Pike County had to endure something even more painful. Uncertainty. For more than 2 years, the question remained unanswered. Who killed the Roden family? Why did they do it? And how could such a carefully planned crime happen in a place where everyone believed they knew their neighbors? The investigation became one of the largest and most complex criminal investigations in Ohio history. Hundreds of investigators worked on the case. Thousands of pieces of evidence were collected. Interviews were conducted. Suspects were examined. Every possibility was explored. Yet for nearly 2 years, there were no arrests. No courtroom. No confession. Only questions. The people of Pike County were forced to live with the knowledge that someone responsible for one of the worst crimes in their state's history had not yet been held accountable. But behind the scenes, investigators were slowly building a case. They were collecting pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden beneath years of silence. And eventually, that silence would be broken. The truth would come from the very people investigators had been watching. A family would be accused of destroying another family. A father, a mother, and 2 sons would become the center of a case that shocked America. The Pike County Massacre was not only a story about 8 lives taken. It was a story about trust. About obsession. About how personal conflicts can grow into something unimaginable. And most importantly, it was a story about the victims whose lives were stolen before anyone had the chance to say goodbye. Because before the investigation, before the suspects, before the courtroom drama, there were simply 8 people. 8 human beings. 8 families of memories. 8 lives that mattered. And on one quiet April night in rural Ohio, they were gone forever. Pike County, Ohio, was not the kind of place where people expected history to be made. It was a region shaped by simplicity. A place where the landscape seemed to move at the same slow pace as the people who lived there. Rolling hills stretched across the horizon. Thick forests surrounded narrow roads. Small farms and modest homes sat separated by long stretches of countryside. For generations, families in Pike County had lived close to the land and close to each other. Many residents had roots that went back decades. Some families had occupied the same properties for years, passing homes from parents to children, carrying traditions forward through generations. It was not a place where people locked their doors because danger felt distant. It was not a place where neighbors avoided each other because they were strangers. It was a place where people recognized familiar vehicles driving down the road. A place where a person's last name often meant something. A place where family connections could stretch across entire communities. That sense of familiarity was one of Pike County's defining characteristics. And it was exactly what made the events of April 2016 so disturbing. Because the crime that unfolded there did not happen in a place known for constant violence. It happened in a community where people believed they understood the people around them. Where trust was part of everyday life. Where the idea that someone could secretly plan the destruction of an entire family seemed almost impossible. Pike County sits in southern Ohio, an area often described as rural Appalachia. The region has a history shaped by hard work, economic struggles, and strong family bonds. Many residents worked in agriculture, construction, local businesses, and industries that connected generations of families to the same communities. Life there was not always easy. But it was familiar. People knew how to survive difficult times. They depended on relatives. They depended on neighbors. They depended on the belief that even when disagreements happened, there were limits to what people would do. That belief would be shattered. The Roden family was part of this world. They were not outsiders passing through. They were deeply connected to the area. Their homes were located in a rural section near Piketon, surrounded by trees, open fields, and quiet roads. The properties were not located in a crowded neighborhood where neighbors could immediately see what was happening. Instead, the homes sat in isolation, That isolation would later become one of the most important elements in understanding the crime. The attacker or attackers were not entering a place filled with witnesses. They were moving through an environment where darkness, distance, and silence could hide terrible actions. The night of April 21, 2016, was ordinary on the surface. There was no warning that anything unusual was about to happen. Families went about their normal routines. People prepared for the next day. Parents cared for their children. Adults handled the small responsibilities of everyday life. Somewhere inside those homes, plans for tomorrow existed. There were conversations that would never be finished. Meals that would never be shared. Messages that would never receive a response. The victims were living their final hours without knowing that danger was approaching. And that detail would later become one of the most painful parts of the case. They were not preparing for a fight. They were not expecting an enemy. They were at home. A place where every person should feel protected. The attack that followed would expose one of the darkest possibilities in human relationships, the danger that can exist when anger, resentment, and obsession remain hidden beneath ordinary appearances. Before the murders, the Roden and Wagner families were not completely unknown to each other. They existed within the same social world. Their lives crossed through relationships, friendships, and family connections. This was not a case involving a random predator selecting victims from a distance. It was much more personal. The people connected to the crime were people who understood the victims' lives. They knew their relationships. They knew their history. They knew the people they were targeting. That reality made the crime feel even more disturbing. Because the greatest fear for many communities is not always the stranger outside the door. Sometimes it is the possibility that danger can come from someone who already knows your name. Someone who has stood in your home. Someone who has shared conversations with you. Someone who knows where you live. As investigators later reconstructed the events, they believed the murders required planning and knowledge. The locations. The timing. The movement between properties. The ability to avoid detection. All of it suggested that whoever carried out the attack had spent time preparing. They were not acting randomly. They had information. They had patience. And they had a reason. But before that conclusion became clear, the community had to live through months of uncertainty. In the days after the murders, Pike County changed. The quiet roads that once represented peace now carried a different feeling. Residents wondered what had happened in their own backyard. They wondered whether the person responsible was still nearby. They wondered whether they could trust the people around them. Fear spread through conversations at stores, restaurants, and community gatherings. People searched for explanations, because unexplained violence creates a unique kind of terror. When a crime has a clear motive, people try to understand it. When a crime appears completely random, people fear that it could happen again. The Pike County killings created both fears at once. The victims were known. The locations were known. But the person responsible remained unknown. And that uncertainty was unbearable. Law enforcement officers understood that solving the case would require patience. They could not rely only on traditional assumptions. They had to examine every possibility. Every relationship. Every disagreement. Every person connected to the victims. The investigation would eventually reveal that the answer was not hidden somewhere far away. It was connected to people who lived within the same circle. But in the early days, no one knew that. At first, investigators had only the scene in front of them. 8 victims. 4 locations. A community searching for answers. And a question that seemed impossible to solve. Who would want an entire family erased? To understand the crime, investigators needed to understand the people who were gone. They needed to look beyond the tragedy and see the lives behind the names. Because every victim was more than a detail in an investigation file. Christopher Roden Sr. was a father. Dana Roden was a mother. Christopher Jr. was a teenager. Frankie Roden was a young man with his own future ahead. Hannah Roden was a young mother. Hazel Gilly was someone's daughter and someone's loved one. Kenneth and Gary Roden were members of a family that had existed long before that terrible night. The crime scene showed how they died. But it did not show who they were. And that became one of the most important responsibilities of the investigation. To uncover the truth, investigators had to reconstruct the lives that were taken. They had to understand the relationships, the conflicts, the emotions, the history. Because somewhere inside those details was the reason 8 people were targeted. The road toward justice would be long. It would take years. It would involve thousands of hours of investigation, painful testimony, and secrets that had remained hidden behind the appearance of an ordinary family life. But before the world learned about the suspects, before the courtroom revealed the evidence, before the Wagner family became associated with one of Ohio's most shocking crimes, there was a community trying to understand how something so terrible could happen in a place that had always felt safe. Pike County was supposed to be a quiet corner of America. A place of family gatherings, familiar faces, and peaceful nights. But after April 22, 2016, the silence felt different. The same forests that once represented beauty became reminders of a mystery. The same roads that once represented home became paths connected to tragedy. And the same community that once believed it knew everyone around them was forced to confront a terrifying question. What if the person responsible had been closer than anyone imagined? The answer would eventually emerge. But first, the world needed to remember the people who were lost. Because the story of Pike County did not begin with a killer. It began with 8 victims who had lives, dreams, and futures. And before their final moments became part of a criminal investigation, they were simply a family living an ordinary life in rural Ohio, before Pike County became known for one of the most shocking crimes in Ohio history, before investigators surrounded quiet country roads with flashing lights, before television cameras arrived and the names Roden and Wagner became known across America, there were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They were parents waking up each morning to take care of their children. They were sons and daughters growing older. They were partners building relationships. They were people with routines, habits, dreams, and plans for the future. The tragedy of Pike County is often remembered through numbers. 8 victims. 4 crime scenes. 1 night of unimaginable violence. But behind those numbers were 8 individual stories. 8 people who had birthdays, favorite foods, personal struggles, private jokes, and memories shared with the people who loved them. They were not simply names written in a police report. They were human beings whose lives ended before their stories were finished. To understand the full weight of what happened, it is necessary to look beyond the crime scene and remember who they were. Because every person taken that night left behind an empty space that could never be filled. Christopher Roden Sr. was 40 years old when he was killed. Known by many simply as Chris, he was a central figure within the Roden family. Like many people in rural Ohio, his life was connected to the land, family, and the responsibilities that came with both. He was a father. He was someone who had spent years building a life around the people closest to him. Those who knew him described a man who valued his family and maintained strong connections with relatives who lived nearby. In small communities like Pike County, family relationships often form the foundation of everyday life. Relatives are not just people you visit occasionally. They are the people who help during difficult moments. They are the people who show up when someone needs assistance. They are the people who share celebrations, holidays, and memories. For Chris Roden Sr., family was not a distant idea. It was part of his identity. His home was not only a place where he lived. It was a place where family life happened. A place where conversations took place. A place where children grew up. A place where people believed they were safe. That belief would be destroyed. Dana Roden, 37 years old, was also among those killed. She was a mother whose life centered around her children and family. To those closest to her, Dana was not remembered because of the way she died. She was remembered because of the way she lived. She was a woman with responsibilities, relationships, and a role within her family that could never be replaced. The loss of a mother changes the entire structure of a family. It creates an absence that is felt in countless small moments. A child reaching for a parent who is no longer there. A holiday without the person who once prepared it. A question that can never receive an answer. Dana's death represented one of the deepest wounds caused by the Pike County tragedy. A family did not simply lose a relative. Children lost a mother. A home lost its center. Christopher Roden Jr. was only 16 years old. At an age when most teenagers are focused on school, friendships, hobbies, and imagining what adulthood might look like, Christopher's life was suddenly taken away. 16 is an age filled with possibilities. It is an age when the future feels endless. A teenager begins to understand who they are becoming. They make plans. They develop dreams. They start thinking about the person they want to become. Christopher never received the chance to experience that future. His death became one of the most painful reminders of the cruelty of the crime. He was not an adult involved in complicated conflicts. He was a teenager. Someone whose life had barely begun. Clarence Frankie Roden was 20 years old. Like many young adults, Frankie was at a stage of transition. He was moving from childhood into adulthood, creating his own identity, and beginning to build a future separate from his parents. He was also a father figure in the life of his young daughter and a partner to Hannah, Hazel Gilly. His relationship with Hannah Roden and the Wagner family connection would later become central to the investigation. But before those details became part of a courtroom battle, Frankie was simply a young man surrounded by family. He was someone with relationships, responsibilities, and people who cared about him. His life represented a future that disappeared overnight. Hannah Mae Roden was 19 years old. Her name would later become one of the most discussed in the entire case, because of the connection between her and Edward Jake Wagner. But Hannah was more than a relationship in an investigation. She was a young woman. A daughter. A mother. A person who had her entire adult life ahead of her. She had recently experienced one of the most important changes in life, becoming a parent. Her daughter was still very young. Like any mother, Hannah had hopes and dreams for her child. She had likely imagined watching her daughter grow older. Teaching her lessons. Celebrating birthdays. Being there through childhood and beyond. Those moments would never happen. Instead, Hannah's name became connected forever to one of the most painful questions surrounding the case. Why? Why would someone want to harm her? Why would someone target her family? Why would a personal conflict grow into such devastating violence? Hannah Hazel Gilly was 20 years old. She was Frankie Roden's girlfriend, and was also present at one of the homes connected to the massacre. Like the others, Hazel was not someone who had any reason to believe she was in danger. She was not expecting violence. She was not involved in a confrontation. She was simply living her life. Her death added another layer of tragedy, because she was not only taken from her own family. She was also connected to the Roden family through love and relationships. Her future ended alongside the people around her. Kenneth Roden was 44 years old. He was another member of the Roden family whose life was cut short. Like the others, he represented the importance of family connections in rural Ohio. The Roden family was large. They were connected through blood, relationships, and years of shared experiences. The loss of Kenneth meant another branch of that family tree was suddenly gone. Gary Roden was 38 years old. His death completed the devastating loss of 8 people connected to the same extended family. Each victim represented a different part of the Roden family story. A father, a mother, a teenager, young adults, relatives, loved ones. Together, their deaths created a wound that extended far beyond the crime scenes. But perhaps the most haunting detail of the Pike County massacre was not only who died. It was who survived. Inside the homes where the murders happened, investigators discovered that children had been present. Young children, including a newborn baby only days old. The fact that these children survived became one of the most emotional elements of the entire case. They were too young to understand what had happened around them. They could not comprehend why their families would never return. They could not understand why the people who loved them were suddenly gone. But they became silent witnesses to one of the darkest moments in their family history. Their survival raised painful questions. Why were they spared? Why were they left behind? How could someone commit such violence and leave children behind in the aftermath? Those questions followed the investigation from the beginning. The Pike County massacre was not simply a crime involving victims and suspects. It was a tragedy involving families. The victims were connected to people who loved them. They had friends who remembered them. They had relatives who carried their memories forward. When the investigation began, authorities needed evidence. They needed timelines. They needed suspects. But they also needed something equally important. They needed to remember that behind every piece of evidence was a person whose life had been taken. The crime would eventually reveal secrets about anger, revenge, and obsession. But before those dark details emerged, there was something investigators and the public needed to understand. The 8 people killed in Pike County were not symbols of a tragedy. They were not just victims of a famous case. They were real people who woke up every day believing they had more time. They had ordinary moments, ordinary problems, ordinary hopes. They went to sleep believing tomorrow would come. But tomorrow never arrived. And the responsibility of uncovering what happened to them would become one of the most important criminal investigations Ohio had ever seen. Because justice would not only be about finding those responsible. It would also be about answering for the lives that were stolen. 8 lives. 8 stories. 8 people who deserved to grow older, make memories, and continue their journeys. Instead, their final chapter became the beginning of a mystery that would take years to solve. The night of April 21, 2016, began without any sign that history was about to change forever. In rural Pike County, the darkness arrived quietly. The roads became empty. The fields surrounding the homes became still. The sounds of everyday life slowly disappeared as families settled into their nighttime routines. Inside their homes, the members of the Roden family had no reason to believe they were facing danger. They were surrounded by the familiar. The same rooms they had lived in, The same walls that had protected them for years. The same places where they had laughed, argued, rested, and dreamed about tomorrow. For them, it was simply another night. But somewhere in that darkness, a plan was already unfolding. A plan that investigators would later describe as deliberate, calculated, and carefully prepared. The Pike County Massacre was not a crime that happened in a sudden burst of anger. It was not an argument that escalated unexpectedly. It was not a confrontation between strangers. The evidence would eventually suggest something much colder. Someone had decided that these people would not survive the night. Someone had chosen their targets. Someone had studied their movements. Someone had prepared for the moment when the homes would be quiet and the victims would be most vulnerable. The exact timeline of those final hours would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Because understanding how the crime happened meant understanding the mindset of the person, or people responsible. The investigators would later believe that the attackers knew the locations of multiple homes connected to the Roden family. They knew where people lived. They knew where they would likely be. They knew how to move through the area without immediately attracting attention. That level of knowledge suggested something deeply personal. The person responsible was not searching randomly. They were not choosing victims by chance. They were following a path created by familiarity. The first signs of violence were hidden behind closed doors. The homes that once represented safety became crime scenes. The places where families had built memories became locations where investigators would spend countless hours searching for answers. As authorities would later discover, the attack involved 4 separate locations connected to the Roden family. The distance between those locations meant that the person or people responsible had to move carefully. They had to navigate the rural roads of Pike County. They had to remain focused. They had to continue carrying out their plan from one location to another. For investigators, this detail was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The murders required movement. They required patience. They required a level of control that suggested the attacker was not overwhelmed by emotion in the moment. Instead, the actions appeared intentional. The victims were found inside their homes and properties. Many were killed while they were asleep or unable to defend themselves. There was no evidence of a chaotic struggle. No indication that the victims had been involved in a violent confrontation. The attack was not a fight. It was an ambush. And that realization created a deeper sense of horror. Because home is supposed to be the final place where people feel protected. A person can understand danger outside. A person can prepare for threats in public. But inside a home, people lower their guard. They sleep. They relax. They believe they are safe. The killer had taken advantage of that basic human trust. The tragedy became even more painful because children were connected to the homes where the murders occurred. Children who were too young to understand the violence around them. Children who would wake up to a world where the people who cared for them were gone. Among the most heartbreaking discoveries was a newborn baby who survived. The baby was only days old. A life that had just begun was surrounded by unimaginable loss. The child would grow up carrying a connection to one of Ohio's darkest criminal cases, even though they were too young to remember the night that changed everything. For investigators arriving at the scenes, the mission was no longer only about solving a crime. It was about protecting the survivors. It was about understanding what happened. And it was about finding the person responsible. But in those first hours, there were more questions than answers. Who could have wanted this family dead? Why would anyone target so many people? How could someone enter multiple homes and commit such violence without being noticed? The early investigation faced an enormous challenge. There was no obvious suspect. There was no immediate confession. There was no clear explanation. Only a collection of crime scenes and a community searching for meaning. As news spread throughout Ohio, the story shocked people across the country. The idea of 8 people being murdered in one night was horrifying enough. But the details made it even more disturbing. This was not an attack in a crowded public place. It happened in a quiet rural area. A place where people expected peace. A place where neighbors believed they knew each other. The murders created a feeling of vulnerability that extended far beyond the Roden family. Residents began wondering whether the person responsible was still nearby. Whether the killer had been watching. Whether another attack could happen. The fear was not only about what had already happened. It was about what nobody knew. In the days following the massacre, investigators began collecting every possible piece of information. They examined the homes. They studied the victims' relationships. They searched for anything that could explain why these particular people had been targeted. One of the first challenges was separating fact from rumor. In a case this shocking, speculation spread quickly. People searched for explanations. Some believed the murders were connected to drugs. Others suspected criminal activity. Some wondered whether someone outside the family had a reason to seek revenge. But investigators knew that assumptions could destroy a case. They needed evidence. They needed facts. They needed to understand the victims before they could understand the killer. And as they looked deeper into the lives of the Roden family, they began finding something important. The answer was not hidden in a random act of violence. It appeared connected to relationships, to history, to conflicts that had existed before the murders. The investigation would eventually focus on a connection between the Roden family and another family in the area. The Wagner family. But on that terrible morning, that connection was not yet clear. All anyone knew was that 8 people were gone. 8 families were grieving. And an entire community was demanding answers. The tragedy of Pike County was not only the violence itself. It was the realization that the victims had no chance to defend themselves. They were not prepared. They were not expecting an enemy. They were simply living their lives. A father. A mother. A teenager. Young adults. Family members. People who believed they would wake up the next morning. The last moments of their lives remain among the most painful parts of the investigation. Not because of what is known, but because of what was stolen from them. Future conversations. Future celebrations. Future memories. All disappeared in one night. And as investigators began the long process of reconstructing those final hours, they faced a question that would define the entire case. Who could plan something so terrible against people they knew? The answer would not come quickly. It would take years. It would require patience, thousands of interviews, and a careful examination of every relationship surrounding the victims. But the first step toward justice began in those quiet homes of Pike County. A place where families once felt safe. A place where 8 lives ended. And a place where investigators would begin searching for the truth hidden in the darkness of that April night. The first officers, who arrived in Pike County on April 22, 2016, were responding to what they believed was a terrible, but isolated tragedy. A possible homicide. A single location. A single victim. But within hours, that assumption disappeared. What they discovered was something far more disturbing. The violence had spread across multiple properties. The victims were not connected by coincidence. They were connected by family. And the person responsible had not simply committed a crime. They had carried out an attack that appeared to have been planned with terrifying precision. The rural landscape of Pike County, which had always represented peace and privacy, suddenly became the center of one of the largest homicide investigations in Ohio history. The quiet roads surrounding Piketon were transformed. Police vehicles filled areas where farm trucks and family cars had once passed. Investigators moved carefully through properties that had once been homes, not crime scenes. Neighbors watched from a distance, trying to understand how such horror could exist in a place they believed they knew. The answer was hidden inside 4 separate locations. 4 places where families had lived their daily lives. 4 places where memories had been created. 4 places that would forever be associated with tragedy. When investigators entered the homes, they were not only searching for evidence. They were trying to reconstruct a story. Every detail mattered. Every object left behind. Every position of every item. Every piece of information could potentially explain what happened during those final hours. The first challenge was understanding the scale of the crime. 8 victims meant 8 lives had to be examined. 8 timelines had to be reconstructed. 8 personal histories had to be explored. Investigators needed to know where each person was. Who had contact with them? Who had seen them before they died? Who may have had a reason to harm them? But before they could answer those questions, they had to process the reality of what they were seeing. The crime scenes revealed something that immediately stood out. This was not a chaotic attack. There were no obvious signs of a struggle that suggested a confrontation between the victims and their attacker. There was no indication that the victims had been prepared for what happened. Instead, the evidence suggested that they had been caught completely off guard. Many appeared to have been attacked while inside their own homes. Places where they should have been protected. Places where they should have been able to close the door and feel safe. The homes themselves became silent witnesses. A child's belongings. Family photographs. Personal items left exactly where they had been. Ordinary objects that suddenly carried a painful meaning. For investigators, these details were not just part of the scene. They represented the lives that had existed there only hours earlier. A cup left behind. A piece of clothing. A room that belonged to someone who would never return. These small reminders made the investigation more than a search for evidence. It became a search for the truth behind 8 stolen lives. As forensic teams worked through the properties, they began collecting thousands of pieces of information. Photographs were taken. Evidence was documented. Every area was examined. Nothing could be ignored. In a case this complex, the smallest detail could become the clue that changed everything. Investigators also faced another major challenge. The killer had not left behind an obvious explanation. There was no message claiming responsibility. No clear motive. No immediate suspect. The crime appeared carefully designed to create confusion. The attacker had not simply wanted to kill. They had wanted to avoid being caught. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. The question was no longer only, who would want to harm the Roden family? The question became, who had enough knowledge about them to carry out such a precise attack? Because the crime required more than anger. It required information. Someone needed to know where the victims were. Someone needed to understand their routines. Someone needed to know the layout of their properties. Someone needed to feel confident enough to enter those homes. That suggested a connection. A relationship. A level of familiarity. As investigators continued examining the evidence, they began looking into the lives of the victims. They studied friendships, family relationships, arguments, financial issues, personal conflicts. Every possible explanation had to be considered. In the beginning, several theories appeared. Some people believed the killings might be connected to illegal activity. The Roden family had previously been connected to investigations involving marijuana cultivation. Because of this, some wondered whether the murders were part of a criminal dispute. Others suggested the possibility of revenge, a business conflict, a personal disagreement, a feud that had escalated beyond control. But investigators did not have the luxury of guessing. A theory was not enough. They needed proof. They needed evidence that could survive a courtroom. And the evidence would take time. The investigation became a massive operation. Local authorities worked alongside state and federal agencies. Detectives interviewed people connected to the victims. They examined phone records. They looked at movements. They searched for anything unusual. Anything that could explain why these 8 people had been targeted. Meanwhile, Pike County remained trapped between grief and fear. Families mourned. Friends remembered the victims. But the question remained unanswered. Who did this? The uncertainty was especially painful, because the crime did not feel random. A random crime is frightening, because it seems impossible to predict. But this crime created another kind of fear. The feeling that someone had carefully chosen these victims. The feeling that someone had been watching. The feeling that the person responsible may have known the family well. As days turned into weeks, the investigation continued. But without an arrest, rumors grew. In small communities, unanswered questions create their own stories. People searched for explanations. They looked at relationships. They examined old disagreements. They wondered whether there had been warning signs that nobody recognized. But behind the scenes, investigators were slowly building a picture of the victims' final days. They were reconstructing their routines. They were determining who had contact with them. They were identifying connections that had previously seemed unimportant. One relationship in particular would eventually become central. The connection between Hannah Roden and Edward Jake Wagner. At the beginning, however, investigators were still gathering information. They were still trying to understand the complicated history between 2 families. They did not yet know that the answers would lead them toward a group of people who were not strangers. They did not yet know that the investigation would eventually point toward an entire family. A family that investigators would accuse of carefully planning the destruction of another. The crime scenes in Pike County told a story of violence. But they did not yet reveal the full story. For that, investigators needed time. They needed patience. And they needed to follow every piece of evidence wherever it led. Because the truth was buried beneath layers of relationships, secrets, and years of personal conflict. The homes where the murders occurred held the first clues. But the real answers were hidden in the lives of the people connected to them. And as the investigation moved forward, detectives would begin uncovering a story far more complicated than anyone expected. A story of 2 families. A story of control and resentment. A story of a conflict that prosecutors would later say transformed into one of the most devastating acts of revenge Ohio had ever seen. But first, investigators had to find the people responsible. And for more than 2 years, that answer remained just out of reach. The silence surrounding Pike County was almost as terrifying as the crime itself. 8 people had been killed. A community was waiting. And somewhere, the person responsible was still free. In the days after the murders, Pike County became a place caught between grief and uncertainty. The shock of losing 8 people was overwhelming enough. But the most frightening part was the question that nobody could answer. Who had done this? The killer was not immediately identified. There was no dramatic arrest. No confession. No obvious suspect waiting at the end of the first day. Instead, investigators faced a case filled with questions. 8 victims. 4 crime scenes. A community desperate for answers. And a person or group responsible, who appeared to have carefully hidden their actions. For law enforcement, the Pike County investigation became a race against time. Every day that passed without an arrest created more uncertainty. Every unanswered question created more fear. Investigators understood that the person responsible had already shown patience and planning. They had entered homes. They had killed multiple people. They had moved between locations. And somehow, they had disappeared afterward. The investigation required a different approach. This was not a simple crime scene where one piece of evidence immediately revealed the truth. It was a complex puzzle. A puzzle built from relationships, personal histories, technology, and human behavior. Detectives began by focusing on the victims. Because in many homicide investigations, the key to understanding the killer begins with understanding the people who were killed. Who were they? Who knew them? Who had conflicts with them? Who benefited from their deaths? The investigators needed to look at every possibility. No theory could be ignored. No connection could be dismissed too quickly. The Roden family had a complicated network of relationships. They were connected through family ties, friendships, and past conflicts. That meant investigators had a wide range of possibilities to consider. At first, rumors spread quickly. In a small community, everyone had a theory. Some believed the murders were connected to drugs. Others believed it was revenge. Some thought the killings were connected to criminal activity. Because the Roden family had previously been involved in investigations related to marijuana cultivation, many people wondered whether the murders were connected to that world. But investigators knew that rumors could be dangerous. A rumor could send a case in the wrong direction. A false assumption could waste valuable time. The detectives needed evidence, not speculation. So they began building the case piece by piece. They interviewed friends and relatives. They examined the victims' daily routines. They reviewed communications. They searched for conflicts that might have existed before the murders. They looked for anyone who had recently shown anger, jealousy, or unusual behavior. And slowly, they began learning more about the relationships surrounding the Roden family. One relationship became especially important. The connection between Hannah Roden and Edward Jake Wagner. Jake Wagner had previously been in a relationship with Hannah. The two shared a daughter. But after their relationship ended, their lives became complicated by disagreements over custody. For investigators, this relationship created an important question. Could a personal conflict have grown into something much darker? At that stage, the answer was still unclear. Many relationships involve disagreements. Many families experience conflict. Most conflicts never become violence. So investigators had to determine whether this was simply a difficult personal situation, or something far more dangerous. They continued collecting evidence. Months passed. The investigation expanded. Hundreds of officers and investigators worked on the case. Thousands of pieces of evidence were gathered. Interviews were conducted again and again. Every detail was examined. The pressure on law enforcement continued to grow. The public wanted answers. The victims' families wanted justice. And the community wanted to know that the person responsible was no longer free. But despite the massive effort, there were no arrests. The case entered a frustrating period. A period where investigators knew something terrible had happened, but could not yet prove who was responsible. For the people of Pike County, this waiting period was painful. The murders had changed the way many residents viewed their own surroundings. The quiet roads no longer felt completely safe. The empty spaces between homes no longer felt peaceful. The community had lost something difficult to describe. It had lost trust. People wondered whether they had unknowingly lived near someone capable of committing such violence. They wondered whether they had seen something unusual, but failed to recognize its importance. They wondered whether the answer had been nearby all along. Behind the scenes, investigators continued working. They followed leads that went nowhere. They investigated people who were eventually ruled out. They examined possibilities that turned out to be dead ends. This is the reality of major criminal investigations. The public often sees only the final moment when suspects are arrested. They do not see the thousands of hours spent chasing information that leads nowhere. They do not see the frustration of investigators searching through mountains of evidence. They do not see the pressure of knowing that 8 families are waiting. The Pike County investigation was built through patience. Slowly, investigators began identifying patterns. They looked at the behavior of people connected to the victims. They examined changes that occurred before and after the murders. They studied relationships that appeared ordinary on the surface, but contained deeper conflicts underneath. The focus gradually shifted toward the Wagner family. George, Billy Wagner III. Angela Wagner. Their sons Edward Jake Wagner and George Wagner IV. To outsiders, the Wagner family appeared to be a normal family living in the same rural community. They were parents and children. They shared a home. They shared daily life. But investigators began examining whether there was something hidden behind that appearance. The idea that an entire family could be involved in a crime of this magnitude shocked many people. Most crimes involve individual offenders. But investigators believed this case was different. They believed the planning, preparation, and execution suggested cooperation. A group effort. A shared secret. The investigation began focusing on the possibility that the murders were not committed by one person acting alone. Instead, authorities believed the crime involved multiple members of the Wagner family. But proving that would require more than suspicion. It would require evidence. It would require connecting each person to the plan. It would require showing how the crime was prepared and carried out. And that evidence would take time. The investigators were not only trying to solve a murder case. They were trying to uncover a hidden world that existed beneath ordinary appearances. A world of resentment, family loyalty, control, and a conflict that prosecutors would later describe as the driving force behind the massacre. For nearly 2 years, the case remained open. The community waited. The victims' families waited. The investigators continued searching. And then, after months of silence, something changed. A breakthrough was approaching. A moment that would finally reveal the direction of the investigation. A moment when the question that had haunted Pike County since April 2016 would finally begin to receive an answer. Who killed the Roden family? The answer would shock everyone. Because the people accused of carrying out the massacre were not unknown outsiders. They were people who had lived among the same community. People who had shared the same roads. People whose names were already familiar. The investigation, that began with 8 victims, would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing accusations in Ohio criminal history. That one family had destroyed another family. But before the arrests came, investigators had to complete the final pieces of their case. They had to turn suspicion into proof. They had to uncover the truth hidden behind 2 years of silence. And they were getting closer. For more than 2 years, the people of Pike County lived with a question that seemed impossible to answer. Who killed the Roden family? The question followed the community everywhere. It was present in conversations between neighbors. It appeared in news reports. It existed in the quiet moments when families thought about the 8 people who were gone. The murders had become a permanent wound. But behind the scenes, investigators were not standing still. While the public saw silence, law enforcement was building a case. Every interview, every piece of evidence, every conversation, every detail collected from the crime scenes. All of it was slowly becoming part of a larger picture. The investigation had moved away from the idea of a random attack. The evidence increasingly pointed toward something much more personal. The killer did not appear to be a stranger. The person responsible seemed to understand the victims' lives, their routines, their homes, their relationships. The investigation eventually focused on the Wagner family. But investigators knew that suspicion alone was not enough. A case involving 8 murders required undeniable evidence. They needed to prove not only that the suspects had a possible motive, but that they had the ability and opportunity to carry out the crime. They needed to explain how the murders happened. They needed to show why these victims were chosen. And most importantly, they needed to connect each person involved to the plan. The turning point came after years of investigation. On November 13, 2018, authorities announced a development that shocked the nation. 4 members of the Wagner family had been arrested. George Billy Wagner III, Angela Wagner, Edward Jake Wagner, George Wagner IV. The family that investigators had quietly examined for months was now at the center of the case. The announcement changed everything. For the first time since the murders, the public had names. The mystery had faces. The question of who might have been responsible had moved from speculation into the courtroom. But the accusations were almost impossible for many people to accept. The suspects were not strangers from outside the community. They were a family. Parents and sons. A household. A group of people who had lived ordinary lives, while investigators believed they were hiding involvement in one of Ohio's most horrific crimes. The arrests created shock far beyond Pike County. Across America, people struggled to understand how a family could allegedly become involved in such violence. Most people think of danger as something that comes from outside. A stranger. An unknown person. Someone disconnected from their lives. But the Pike County case suggested something far more unsettling. The people accused were individuals who knew the victims. They were connected through relationships and history. They understood the people they were accused of targeting. According to investigators, the connection between the 2 families centered around Edward Jake Wagner and Hannah Roden. Years earlier, Jake and Hannah had been in a relationship. Together, they had a daughter. But after their relationship ended, a custody dispute developed. For most people, conflicts involving relationships and children create emotional stress. They create arguments. They create frustration. But they eventually end through conversation, compromise, or legal decisions. Prosecutors would later argue that in this case, the conflict grew into something far more extreme. They alleged that the custody dispute became the foundation for a revenge plan. A plan that would eventually lead to 8 deaths. The arrests were not the end of the investigation. In many ways, they created a new chapter. Now prosecutors had to prove their case. They had to transform years of investigation into courtroom evidence. They had to explain how 4 family members could allegedly participate in such a complex crime. And they had to answer questions that had haunted the community. How was the crime planned? Who knew about it? Who participated? Who made the decisions? The answers would emerge slowly. As the legal process moved forward, investigators revealed more details about the alleged preparation. The prosecution's theory was that the murders were not spontaneous. They were planned. They were organized. They were carried out with the goal of eliminating specific people. This idea was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, because it suggested that the tragedy was not the result of a single moment of uncontrolled rage. It was the result of decisions made over time. Decisions that allowed anger and resentment to grow. Decisions that eventually turned a personal conflict into a deadly crime. The arrest of the Wagner family also changed the emotional landscape for the victims' relatives. For years, families of the victims had lived without answers. They had buried loved ones without knowing who was responsible. They had faced birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries with unanswered questions. Now, they finally had suspects. But justice would still require a long journey. An arrest is not a conviction. An accusation is not a verdict. The evidence would have to be presented. Witnesses would have to testify. A jury would have to decide. And the defendants would have the opportunity to defend themselves. The first major breakthrough in the case came not only from the arrests, but from what happened afterward. One of the accused members of the Wagner family would eventually become a crucial figure in the prosecution's case. Edward Jake Wagner. His decision would dramatically change the direction of the investigation. After years of maintaining silence, Jake Wagner would eventually agree to cooperate with prosecutors. His cooperation would provide investigators with an inside look into what they believed happened. For the first time, they would hear details from someone who had been directly connected to the people accused. The investigation, that had spent years searching for answers, was finally receiving information from within the circle of suspects. But that information came with a price. Because the person providing it was also accused of being involved. His story would become one of the most controversial parts of the case. Was he revealing the truth? Was he trying to reduce his own responsibility? Could his words be trusted? Those questions would become central during the trials. But before the courtroom battles began, one thing was clear. The silence surrounding Pike County had finally been broken. The families of the victims no longer had to wonder whether anyone would ever be held accountable. The community no longer had to live without knowing who investigators believed was responsible. And America learned that the answer was not a stranger hiding in the darkness. The answer was a family. A family accused of turning a personal conflict into a devastating act of violence. The Pike County massacre had entered a new phase. The mystery was over. Now came the pursuit of justice. The search for truth would move from quiet investigations and hidden evidence into public courtrooms where every decision, every conversation, and every accusation would be examined. The world would finally hear the story behind the 8 deaths. But the most difficult question remained. What could drive ordinary-looking people to plan something so extraordinary? To answer that question, investigators would have to look deeper. Beyond the crime scenes. Beyond the evidence. Beyond the arrests. They would have to examine the relationships, emotions, and choices that led to one of the darkest nights in Ohio history. Because the Pike County Massacre was never only about how 8 people died. It was about why they were chosen. And the answer would reveal a story of obsession, control, and a family secret that could no longer remain hidden. For years, the people of Pike County had waited for answers. They waited through the shock of the murders. They waited through the long investigation. They waited through months of uncertainty, when the person responsible remained unknown. And even after the arrests of the Wagner family in 2018, one major question remained. What truly happened on the night 8 people were killed? The arrests had changed everything, but the full story was still hidden. Investigators had theories. Prosecutors had evidence. Families had suspicions. But the complete picture of what happened inside those 4 homes on that April night had not yet been revealed. Then came a moment that transformed the entire case. A confession. A decision by one member of the Wagner family that would expose the alleged plan from the inside. Edward Jake Wagner had spent years at the center of the investigation. He was the person whose relationship with Hannah Roden had become one of the most important connections between the Wagner and Roden families. He was also the person prosecutors believed could explain the motive behind the massacre. For investigators, his cooperation represented something they rarely receive in a case of this magnitude. A direct account from someone who was allegedly involved. But it also created a complicated situation. Because Jake Wagner was not an innocent witness. He was not someone standing outside the tragedy looking in. He was one of the people accused. His words carried enormous importance, but they also raised difficult questions. Could someone involved in a crime be trusted to tell the truth? Was he accepting responsibility? Or was he attempting to save himself by placing more blame on others? Those questions would follow him throughout the legal process. In 2021, Edward Wagner made a dramatic decision. He pleaded guilty to his role in the murders and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. The agreement changed the direction of the case. For years, investigators had been trying to understand what happened behind closed doors. Now they had someone who could describe the events from inside the Wagner family. According to prosecutors, Jake Wagner provided details about the planning, preparation, and execution of the attack. His testimony would become a central part of the case against other members of his family. The picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Prosecutors argued that the murders were not the result of a sudden emotional explosion. They claimed the crime was the final stage of a long process of anger, resentment, and obsession. At the center of that alleged conflict was Hannah Roden. Jake and Hannah had once shared a relationship. They had a child together. But after their separation, their relationship became complicated. The issue of custody created tension between them. According to prosecutors, Jake became increasingly focused on gaining control over the situation. Instead of accepting the end of the relationship and moving forward, prosecutors argued that resentment grew. And eventually, that resentment transformed into something far more dangerous. The idea that a custody dispute could lead to 8 deaths was difficult for many people to comprehend. Most disagreements between former partners, even painful ones, do not become violent. Most people find ways to separate their emotions from their actions. But prosecutors argued that this case represented an extreme example of what can happen when anger becomes an obsession. A disagreement became a fixation. A fixation became a plan. And the plan became a massacre. Jake Wagner's cooperation also placed new attention on the role of his family members. According to prosecutors, the crime was not something one person could have carried out alone. They alleged that the planning required cooperation, knowledge, preparation, They argued that each member of the Wagner family played a role. George Wagner III, the father. Angela Wagner, the mother. George Wagner IV, the older son. And Edward Jake Wagner. The accusations painted a disturbing picture of a family united around a secret. A family where loyalty did not prevent violence, but instead allegedly helped make it possible. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the amount of time that passed before the truth emerged. For nearly 2 years after the murders, the Wagner family continued living their lives. They were not immediately exposed. They were not publicly identified. They remained part of the community. That reality became one of the most shocking elements of the case. Because it suggested that the people investigators believed were responsible had managed to maintain an appearance of normal life while carrying the weight of a devastating secret. The investigation had shown that solving a crime is not only about finding physical evidence. It is also about understanding human behavior. The investigators had to look beyond what people said. They had to examine actions, patterns, relationships, the things people did before and after the murders. And eventually, they believed those details pointed toward the Wagner family. Jake Wagner's confession became a turning point because it gave prosecutors a narrative. It allowed them to explain not only what happened, but why they believed it happened. The murders were allegedly connected to a desire for control. A desire to remove obstacles. A desire to ensure that a custody dispute would never continue. But the confession did not erase the pain. It did not bring back the 8 people who were killed. It did not undo the suffering experienced by their families. For the loved ones of the victims, the confession represented a complicated moment. There was relief because answers were finally coming. But there was also anger. Because the truth meant accepting that the deaths were not an accident. They were not random. They were not caused by an unknown outsider. According to prosecutors, they were the result of deliberate choices made by people who knew the victims. People who understood their lives. People who knew exactly what they were taking away. The emotional weight of the case became even heavier as the legal process moved forward. The confession created a path toward justice, but it also forced everyone involved to confront the darkest details of the crime. The public wanted to understand how a family could become involved in such a terrible act. How could parents and children allegedly sit together, discuss a plan, and allow it to happen? How could ordinary family relationships become connected to extraordinary violence? There are no simple answers to those questions. Cases like Pike County reveal the complicated nature of human behavior. They show how anger can grow. How resentment can become dangerous. How loyalty can sometimes protect the wrong things. And how people can hide disturbing actions behind the appearance of normal life. As the prosecution prepared for trial, the focus moved toward George Wagner IV. Unlike Jake Wagner, who had agreed to cooperate, George Wagner IV would face a jury. The courtroom would become the next battlefield. There, prosecutors would present evidence. Witnesses would testify. And a jury would decide whether the accusations against him were true. The world had waited years to understand what happened in Pike County. Now, the answers would come through testimony and evidence. The story that began with 8 deaths would finally be examined in public. But before the final verdicts, there was still one major challenge. The prosecution had to prove that the evidence was strong enough. They had to show that the people accused were not only connected to the tragedy. They had to prove they were responsible. And inside the courtroom, every detail would matter. Every word. Every piece of evidence. Every memory from that terrible night. Because justice for the 8 victims depended on one final question. Could the truth survive the courtroom? The answer would determine whether the Pike County massacre would end with unanswered questions, or with accountability. After years of investigation, uncertainty, and painful waiting, the Pike County massacre finally reached the place where the truth would be tested. The courtroom. For the families of the victims, the trial represented something they had waited for since April 2016. A chance to hear the evidence. A chance to confront the person prosecutors believed was responsible. A chance to finally understand how 8 members of their family could be taken away in a single night. But a courtroom does not erase pain. It does not bring back the people who were lost. It does not repair the empty spaces left behind. It can only answer one question. Was justice served? In the case of George Wagner IV, that question would be decided through weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional revelations. The trial began in 2022, more than 6 years after the murders. By that point, the story of the Pike County massacre had already become one of the most infamous criminal cases in Ohio. People across the country knew the basic details. 8 victims. 4 crime scenes. A family accused of destroying another family. But knowing the headlines was different from hearing the evidence. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors had the responsibility of explaining not only what happened, but how they believed it happened. They had to take years of investigation and transform it into a clear narrative for the jury. They needed to show that George Wagner IV was not simply connected to the crime. They needed to prove that he knowingly participated. The prosecution presented a picture of a family that, according to their argument, had been united by a shared purpose. They claimed the Wagner family had spent time preparing for the attack. They claimed the murders were carefully planned. And they argued that George Wagner IV played an active role in carrying out the crime. The central theme of the prosecution's case was preparation. They argued that this was not an impulsive act. It was not something that happened because of a sudden argument or moment of rage. Instead, they described a process. A series of decisions. A plan that developed over time. For the jury, the challenge was understanding the difference between being aware of a crime and participating in one. The prosecution needed to prove that George Wagner IV was not simply present after the fact. They needed to prove that he was part of the plan. One of the most important elements of the trial was the testimony of Edward Jake Wagner. Jake had already pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Now, his words became central evidence against his brother. His testimony offered the jury a rare look into the alleged actions and thoughts of someone inside the accused group. But his testimony also carried controversy. The defense argued that Jake had a powerful reason to tell a certain version of events. He had already accepted responsibility. He had already received the benefits of a plea agreement. His cooperation could influence the outcome of his own situation. Because of this, the defense questioned whether Jake's statements could be fully trusted. They argued that a person trying to reduce their own punishment might shift blame onto others. This created one of the most important challenges of the trial. The jury had to decide not only what Jake said. They had to decide whether they believed him. The courtroom became a place where 2 different stories collided. The prosecution presented a story of planning, cooperation, and family involvement. The defense presented a story of uncertainty, questioning whether the evidence truly proved George Wagner IV's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Every detail mattered. Every piece of testimony became part of the larger picture. The jury heard about the relationships between the Wagner and Roden families. They heard about the custody dispute involving Jake Wagner and Hannah Roden. They heard about the investigation that followed the murders. They heard about the evidence collected over years. The trial forced everyone to look closely at the moments before and after the killings. Because in a case with no surviving eyewitnesses to the murders themselves, the surrounding evidence became crucial. Investigators had to show the jury how they believed events unfolded. They had to connect the evidence. They had to explain why they believed the Wagner family was responsible. For the victims' families, listening to the testimony was emotionally exhausting. Every detail brought back the reality of what they had lost. The trial was not simply about legal arguments. It was about 8 people whose lives had been interrupted. Every mention of their names carried memories. Every photograph shown in court represented a person who should have been there. A father. A mother. A son. A daughter. A young couple. Family members who deserved more time. The emotional weight of the trial came from the contrast between the ordinary lives of the victims and the extraordinary violence that ended them. They were not famous people. They were not symbols. They were people from a rural Ohio community who expected to grow older. They expected more birthdays. More conversations. More family gatherings. Instead, their loved ones were sitting in a courtroom years later, waiting for accountability. As the trial continued, prosecutors presented evidence they believed showed careful preparation. They argued that the crime required knowledge and coordination. They argued that the accused had the opportunity to carry out the attack. And they argued that the motive connected back to the custody dispute involving Hannah Roden. The defense, however, challenged the prosecution's interpretation. They questioned the strength of certain evidence. They questioned witness credibility. They reminded the jury that suspicion was not the same as proof. The burden of proof in a criminal trial is extremely high. A person cannot be convicted simply because a story seems possible. The evidence must establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard was at the center of the trial. 4 weeks, the jury listened. They watched. They examined the evidence. They considered the testimony of people connected to the case. Then, after hearing both sides, they faced the decision that would determine the next chapter of the Pike County massacre. Was George Wagner responsible for the deaths of 8 people? The answer came after deliberation. The jury found George Wagner guilty on multiple charges related to the murders. The verdict represented a major moment in the long journey toward justice. For the victims' families, it meant that another person had been held accountable. For investigators, it confirmed the case they had spent years building. For the community, it brought a sense of closure after years of uncertainty. But even with the conviction, the tragedy remained. A verdict could not undo the events of April 2016. It could not return the 8 people who were gone. It could not erase the memories of that morning when a family member opened a door and discovered something unimaginable. The trial had answered some questions. But it also left people reflecting on deeper ones. How could a conflict between people become so destructive? How could a family allegedly allow resentment to grow into violence? How could a community miss the signs before such a terrible act occurred? The Pike County massacre was no longer only a criminal investigation. It had become a study of human behavior. Of obsession. Of control. Of the consequences of allowing anger to consume judgment. And as the courtroom chapter ended, another chapter began. The chapter of consequences. The chapter of sentences. The chapter of remembering the people who were lost. Because justice was never only about the people convicted. It was about the 8 victims, whose lives deserved to be remembered. And after years of waiting, their names finally stood at the center of the story once again. For the families of the victims, justice had never been about revenge. It was never about celebrating the suffering of another person. It was about recognition. Recognition that 8 lives had been stolen. Recognition that what happened inside those quiet Ohio homes was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, and not a tragedy without an answer. For years, the families of Christopher Roden Sr., Dana Roden, Christopher Roden Jr., Frankie Roden, Hannah Roden, Hannah, Hazel Gilly, Kenneth Roden, and Gary Roden carried the weight of uncertainty. They attended funerals without knowing who was responsible. They marked birthdays without their loved ones. They watched children grow older without parents who should have been there. They lived with memories of people who were gone while the person, or people responsible, remained unknown. The arrests of the Wagner family in 2018 brought a new chapter. The confession and cooperation of Edward Jake Wagner brought more answers. And the trial of George Wagner IV brought a verdict. But justice in a case this large does not arrive in one single moment. It comes slowly. Through evidence. Through testimony. Through painful reminders of what was lost. And finally, through sentences. After George Wagner IV was found guilty, attention turned toward the consequences. The verdict represented accountability, but it also forced everyone involved to look directly at the scale of the tragedy. 8 people were dead. 8 families had been changed forever. And the court now had to determine the punishment for the person the jury had found responsible. The prosecution argued that the seriousness of the crime demanded the strongest possible response. They described a case involving planning, multiple victims, and a level of preparation that showed deliberate intent. They argued that the murders were not the result of one terrible moment. They were the result of decisions made over time. According to prosecutors, the evidence showed a crime created through planning and cooperation. They emphasized that the victims were attacked in their own homes. Places where they should have been safe. Places where they should have been protected. The defense, however, continued to argue that the situation was more complicated. They challenged aspects of the evidence and reminded the court that every defendant has rights, even in cases involving horrifying crimes. But the jury had already made its decision. The conviction stood. And the court moved forward. George Wagner IV received multiple life sentences, without the possibility of parole for his role in the deaths of the 8 victims. The sentence reflected the extraordinary scale of the crime. 8 lives had been taken. And the court's decision ensured that he would spend the rest of his life imprisoned. For many members of the victims' families, the sentence brought a sense of relief. But relief is not the same as healing. A prison sentence can provide accountability. It cannot restore what was lost. It cannot bring back a father. It cannot bring back a mother. It cannot return a child to the family that loved them. The empty chairs remained. The photographs remained. The memories remained. Justice had arrived, but the pain had never left. The case also continued with other members of the Wagner family facing legal consequences. Angela Wagner and George, Billy Wagner III remained central figures in the prosecution's pursuit of justice. The accusations against the family painted a picture that shocked many people. A family that investigators believed had turned inward, using loyalty not to protect one another from danger, but allegedly to protect a secret. The idea was deeply disturbing. Families are often viewed as places of safety. Places where people find support. Places where trust begins. But the Pike County case presented a much darker possibility. What happens when loyalty becomes blind? What happens when protecting family means protecting something destructive? These questions remained long after the courtroom doors closed. One of the most important parts of the case was the role of Edward Jake Wagner. His decision to plead guilty, and cooperate changed the direction of the investigation. Without his testimony, prosecutors faced a much more difficult path. But his role also created complicated emotions. He was both a source of information and a person accused of taking part in the tragedy. For the victims' families, hearing his words meant confronting the reality of what prosecutors said happened. It meant hearing details about a crime that had already taken away so much. It meant listening to explanations that could never truly explain the loss. Because some questions have no satisfying answer. A motive can explain why someone acted. It cannot justify what happened. A conflict can explain where anger began. It cannot explain why innocent people had to die. The Pike County Massacre remains one of Ohio's most disturbing criminal cases, because of the contrast between the motive and the outcome. At its center was a personal dispute. A disagreement involving relationships and custody. A conflict that, according to prosecutors, escalated into something beyond imagination. 8 people who were not involved in that dispute lost their lives. A teenager lost his future. Parents lost their children. Children lost their parents. A community lost its sense of security. The case also changed how people viewed the dangers of hidden conflicts. Many crimes are visible before they happen. Arguments happen openly. Threats are made. Warning signs appear. But sometimes the most dangerous situations develop quietly. Behind normal conversations. Behind familiar faces. Behind appearances that suggest everything is fine. The Pike County investigation showed how difficult it can be to recognize what someone may be planning. For years, the Wagner family lived in the same world as everyone else. They drove the same roads. Visited the same places. Interacted with the same community. Yet investigators later alleged that behind that ordinary appearance was a plan that would destroy another family. That contrast became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. The crime did not come from a distant threat. It came from within a familiar circle. And that realization left a permanent mark on Pike County. Years after the murders, people continued remembering the victims. Because the final chapter of the story was never supposed to be about the killers. It was supposed to be about those who were lost. Christopher Roden Sr., who was remembered as a father. Dana Roden, whose family felt the loss of a mother. Christopher Roden Jr., a teenager whose life ended far too soon. Frankie Roden, who never had the chance to fully experience adulthood. Hannah Roden, a young mother whose daughter would grow up without her. Hannah Gilley, whose life and future were taken away. Kenneth Roden and Gary Roden, members of a family forever changed by violence. Their names represent more than a criminal case. They represent real people. Real memories. Real lives. The Pike County Massacre will always be remembered because of the horror of what happened. But remembering only the violence gives the killers too much importance. The true meaning of the case is found in the people who were taken. The families who survived. The children who continued growing up. The community that had to rebuild. The investigators who spent years searching for answers. And the truth that eventually emerged from the darkness. The justice system could punish those responsible. But only memory could preserve the lives of those who were lost. And that may be the most important lesson of Pike County. Behind every headline is a human story. Behind every crime scene is a family. Behind every victim is a life that mattered. 8 people entered history because of how they died. But they should be remembered because of how they lived.